Okay, is that working now? Okay, great. Thanks, Isabella. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see you tonight here. My first event here at Land of Medicine Buddha. This is the first time I've been here since pre-pandemic. 2019 was the last time I was here teaching, but it's wonderful to be back. Such a beautiful center. Hello, folks online. Good to see you all. All right, let's go ahead and begin. Just like to start every class with a little meditation, give us a chance to sort of focus our mind a bit, let go of whatever distractions we might have from our day. And then also to begin to explore this topic a little bit. So I'll give some prompts for you to think about. And then we'll set our motivation, our intention for being here as well. So spend the first few minutes just focusing on the breath in whatever way you prefer. If you need a suggestion, I usually suggest to tune into the sensation at the tip of the nose where you feel the air coming in and out as you inhale, as you exhale, and just stay present there as best as you can. And then when you see that the mind has wandered, then just gently let go of whatever it was that distracted you and guide the mind back to the breath. Okay, so we'll go ahead and begin the meditation now. We'll do this in silence, working with the breath for just a few minutes, and then I'll come in and lead you in a reflection. So now let's turn our minds towards this topic of fear that we're going to be discussing tonight. And let's start with ourselves and just reflect for the next minute or two on the way in which fear is working in your mind right now. And it has different levels. Sometimes it's just a small kind of sense of apprehension or dread. Sometimes it can be much more severe, a bit more debilitating type of fear. But just reflect on how fear is manifesting in your own mind, the things that you are generating some fear about. Perhaps it's the upcoming election. Perhaps it's what's going on with our planet around climate change and all the manifestations of that. Perhaps it's something much more individual in regard to a situation in your life. But just take a minute or two again to reflect on how fear is operating in your mind. And then think about the people who are in your life that are close to you, friends, family, co-workers, people who you're quite kind of seeing on a day-to-day basis, perhaps, or pretty frequently, so that you have an idea as well in regard to what it is that they fear. What are the fears that are coming up for them? And just identify a few of those, thinking about the people who are in your life who are close to you. And then extend this out a bit further to think about the community that you live in, the city or town, the people whose fears might be overheard when you're at the grocery store or just as you go about your daily business. You get a sense for it even in reading the local newspapers. What are the sorts of things that people have some dread about, have some fear in their hearts because of what's going on again in this world, in their communities? And just reflect on that for a moment. And then take it one step further, go out to the national level. And we all pay attention to some degree to national news. We hear what's going on, again, around some of the events that are happening in our world. And what are the sense of fear that you kind of have picked up on in regard to national headlines and national ways of talking about what's going on? Just reflect on that, how fear is also manifesting there at that level. And then finally, at a global level, we may not have as much of a kind of our fingers on the pulse of every country in the world, but nonetheless, we have some indication of the sorts of things that are bringing fear into the hearts and minds of people like ourselves in other countries, especially countries where there are difficulties, problems, war, famine, and so on. And take a moment or two to reflect on how fear is also operating in their lives. So even in this short investigation, we can see that fear is pretty prevalent throughout our world. in all the various pockets of the world. Some of it may be useful, but a lot of it may be unnecessary. And moreover, maybe an opportunity for beings like ourselves to work with, to try to learn from our fear. So generate a motivation that starts with yourself. Each of you are here tonight because of your own concern about working with fear and a desire to be able to have tools to look at fear and to actually transform it to some degree. And generate that motivation to be here, to change your own mind, to be able to confront fear more confidently. But then, as we've seen in examining this kind of growing circle of beings in this world, can generate a motivation to be here for others as well. Can be one less fearful person in the world, and thereby trying to help others to alleviate their fear, to confront and work with their fear. And just generate that motivation that's much more far reaching, thinking that you're here not just for yourself, but for all beings who deal with fear, trying to help every one of them to find the peace that they seek and to be free from all fear and suffering. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So again, this topic of fear, it's kind of interesting. The first time I was asked to teach on this, because it's not a topic that I hear Buddhist teachers talking about that much. And yet, again, it is pretty common in our world. And I was asked back in 2015 by the Vipassana Sangha in Santa Fe, where I live, to teach on this. And I think it was a woman named Ellen Miller. And she wrote to me and she says, "What do you think about the issue of fear and the subtle and not so subtle role it plays in our lives?" He says, "I think it's fascinating on a personal level, nationally and internationally. Fear and the creation of fear seems to greatly influence the way things are being played out in our society." And she talked about a number of issues then, that were relevant at that time, but they're all still relevant. And we kind of keep recycling issues, and our fear just keeps going along with all of those issues that we deal with in our world. So I'm hoping that tonight will be an opportunity to take a look at this emotion of fear. I do find it quite interesting. One thing I'll mention is that in the more traditional teachings, when we go into Buddhist psychology and kind of picking apart our minds and understanding it, there's a course called Minds and Mental Factors. Mental factors are just kind of if you were to isolate various components of our minds and give names to them, and they can include things like jealousy and greed and anger and all those sorts of crazy states of mind. And they can include, helpful states of mind that we can have, and also a lot of other more functional factors. But fear isn't on the list. It's kind of interesting. We use fear sometimes even in Buddhism as a motivator, as a way of helping us to address things that we perhaps should be rightly fearful of. And we'll talk about that shortly. But nonetheless, it's not on the list. And so part of tonight, I really want to examine, well, where does fear fit into this sort of view of Buddhism, of psychology, human psychology, and understanding our minds? Because again, it's not something that is normally taught. And even in those teachings on minds and mental factors, it isn't really referred to. So I'm going to start with a little quote. This was actually a quote that came from Venerable Rabina. Many of you know Venerable Rabina, a wonderful Australian teacher. She's been a nun in our tradition for many years, decades now, or I think she's in her fifth decade of being a nun. But anyway, she's a really dynamic teacher. And right after the pandemic started, our center in Santa Fe invited her to do a talk because obviously, if we all recall, those years back, 4 years ago when it all began, there was a lot of fear and it was really palpable in our society, right? Because it was happening everywhere and it was just overwhelming. And at the initial stages, nobody even was quite aware of how it was being transmitted and what was happening and how would we protect ourselves. And everybody was washing all their groceries when they got home from the store and doing all those crazy things, right? And so there was just this whole kind of undercurrent of fear that we were all living with. So I'm going to share with you a quote that she gave from that teaching, which I think really sets the stage for what we're looking at tonight, even though we're not looking at the pandemic in the way that we were 4 years ago. She says, it seems that there's nowhere on the planet right now that isn't suffering from the presence of the coronavirus and its consequences. And it's bringing so much fear and anxiety. And she says, this is natural, of course, but that doesn't mean we should take fear for granted. We shouldn't fall into the trap of believing that because fear is natural, we can't change it. This is kind of the main teaching the Buddha gave throughout his entire, teaching career was that we can change our minds. We can work with our minds. And of course, our minds are the source of all of our happiness. Our minds are the source of all of our suffering. We're not denying that the external world plays a role. The presence of the coronavirus and what was happening 4 years ago was playing a role in instigating some of that. But our minds are what dictates what we actually experience as we go through all the various things that might induce some fear or might bring us some trepidation. Last thing she said was, of course, we can. Of course, we can change our minds. That's the fundamental point that Buddha makes. That's the essence of his teachings and practice. Our mind is not set in stone. We can change it. And of course, that's again the heart of what the Buddha taught is that we will experience things through the lens of our mind, through what we are doing with our minds. And we can create very, very fearful minds. Again, recall what was happening at that time. You know, um, for me, it was obviously, yeah, I had a lot of the same fears, but I do feel really blessed that I had a lot of teachings that I could look to and try to utilize during that time. But that's the whole point, again, is that if we have teachings and things that we can look at and work with, then we can make a difference in our minds and what we actually experience. So these are the 5 things I want to investigate with you tonight, and we'll do a little bit of discussion with this as well, and there'll be an opportunity for questions later as well after I've gone through the main lecture here. What is fear? Really just getting at, because we don't have a classic Buddhist definition of it, how could we describe it? And then that leads us really into where does it come from? Because if it's not identified as something separate in our minds in the Buddhist teachings on psychology, well, then what is driving it? What are the things that are behind it? And I'll share some of what Venerable Robina said on that even, because I found it quite insightful. And then third, what are the effects of fear? Look at a little bit at what fear can do to us, how it can sometimes cause problems. Certainly there again, we're going to look at different types of fear. Some fear can actually be very motivational. And then fourth, how do we work with it? And that's the big topic that we want to spend the most time on because I hope that all of you can walk away from this teaching having a little bit understanding of how to work with fear because it's not going to go away. I mean, that's the thing. The eventual result that we all want to attain, state of Buddhahood, is said to be fearless. And you don't have any fears at that point because there's no longer any sort of central thing around which that fear would be generated. All of the misconceptions in our minds have been removed. We'll look at that as part of, where fear comes from. But in the meantime, fear is going to be something that occurs in our lives. As we watch things go on in our world, and things have always been going on in our world, they just seem to be exacerbated to a greater degree in our current situation, our times. And then finally, this sort of closing investigation, what does fearlessness look like? Where is it really coming from and so on. So what is fear? I went back, to kind of dictionary definitions of fear for the first one. And there it was called a reaction to something that may happen in the future. I found that incredibly vague because you can have positive things that can happen in the future, right? And so I wouldn't call that a fear. I might call that an anticipation or, whatever. But a reaction to something negative that may happen in the future, I think is probably a good way to put it. And then Tara Brach, a really wonderful teacher in Buddhism, she calls it and describes it as the anticipation of future pain. I kind of like that definition because it's really kind of turning us in the direction of where does fear come from? We always are waking up every day to some degree with an expectation that things are going to go well for us. I think every one of us has that as our kind of default mode, right? We get up and we go, oh, another day. Well, I hope that this goes well and I hope that goes well. We're kind of going about our business. And then when things come into our experience or we start thinking about things that we've been forewarned may happen, well, then fear can start to arise because it's things going in an opposite direction than what we are expecting. We don't even talk that much in Buddhism about expectations, but expectations are a big part of our disappointment. If every day when we wake up, we expect everything is going to go our way, the traffic's going to be fine, I'm going to get to work on time, all this is going to happen, everyone's going to be kind to me, I'm not going to have any problems getting the things done that I need to, da da da. Well, then naturally we're going to get disappointed. Naturally, we're going to have problems. And of course, fear is the response to those sorts of things happening, where we just fall into that trap of generating some, again, trepidation, anxiety about what is going on potentially in our future. Um, I pointed this out in the meditation. I mean, the election is bringing up a lot of fear for a lot of people, and it's on all sides of the fence. I won't say both sides of the fence because there's even people who don't consider themselves on one side or the other. But I think in this country in particular right now, there's a preponderance of fear. There's a lot of people that are living in that day in and day out. That's kind of what they're contending with. And that's what's happening is they're anticipating some future pain, some future difficulty, some future suffering that they or their loved ones will have to go through on the basis of the results of this election. So there's no denying that it's out there and that it's in here as well, that we are all dealing with it, contending with it to some degree. So let's take a look at where it comes from, and this might involve a little bit of an explanation of some of the factors that play a role in it, though hopefully many of you have seen some of this before. When we talk about where fear comes from, um, first to begin with, the future pain that we are anticipating is also an anticipation of loss, of our no longer experiencing the sense of comfort or security we've somehow gotten used to having. This is what I was pointing out and what I just said. We do have a default mode that kind of expects things to go the way that we want them to be happening in the way that we would like them to be. And I'm not going to kind of poke holes in that and say we shouldn't have those thoughts at all. I mean, it's good to have some ideals about how we would like things to be in our world. I think that's very powerful motivating force. But nonetheless, if we do find ourselves setting ourselves up for disappointment every day, well, then that's not really very productive because we spent all this energy into setting up this expectation that we think is going to happen, and then it's crushed when we experience something that is different to that. So fear, when we talk about future pain, there are many dimensions to it. Um, the Buddha himself taught that things are uncertain in our world. This is one of the things that we deal with as a reality. And we can't really count on things always being the same way. I mean, look at how much things have changed in our lifetimes. However many decades you've lived, life has certainly changed, even in the time that you've spent here. And it's been changing drastically. It seems even more kind of rapidly in our age. So this is one idea is to get this kind of bigger view of what we mean by future pain. And he says, however, sometimes this anticipation of future pain or loss of comfort can be useful. And I'm going to use here the fear that causes us to be more attentive to our actions due to not wanting unfavorable results. And I'll just use a medical example. I mean, I myself had that happen to me when I was studying over in Italy at our program there. You'd think, oh, he's in Italy. He's, right by the Mediterranean Sea and probably eating a very healthy Mediterranean diet. But at the center where I was staying, the food actually was not that good for us. It was a lot of carbohydrates and not so much protein. And, everything was really kind of messing with my system. I came home to the US on my summer break and I went to see a doctor. Happened to be my father's doctor. And my father had passed away in 2000. And my father's doctor told me, he said, based on your blood work and everything going on with you, you keep eating the way you are and doing the things you're doing, and you're going to die early like your father did. Well, that's a big motivating factor to change my diet and to get the exercise and do things. To have someone present you with what we might call a rational fear is actually pretty useful for us. So I do want to delineate that we're not, when we talk about fear, we're not talking across the board. Everything that we identify as fear is something that's going to be problematic for us because some levels of fear are actually good for us to kind of register a desire to change things. And maybe that's happened to a number of you in regard to, health situations or other things in your life where you've gotten to that place where you go, oh, that's a healthy fear for me to have. Even in Buddhism, we have a number of topics that we encourage people to investigate and meditate on and study. And one of them is, for example, death. to generate an understanding that death is going to come for every one of us, not so that we live our lives with this fearful, anticipation that at any moment we're going to get struck down by lightning, but rather that we do something meaningful with the time that we have. There are purposes for instilling some sense of fear that are really quite useful. So I want to point that out as well, is that when we talk about fear, we can delineate different types of it that we might make a distinction in terms of how we deal with them, how we work with them. So again, we can say there's a healthy or wholesome fear that can actually be very beneficial for us. And we can also say that there's an unhealthy or unwholesome fear. It's kind of interesting. I went back to, I never studied like Western psychology and Freud and Jung and all these wonderful, people who developed Western psychology. But Freud himself defined things in terms of rational and irrational fears. And he, of course, has a different criteria for, looking at those and discerning what they are. But in Buddhism, we can say kind of the same thing. Again, some of our fears can become a bit neurotic, can become things that are not really that beneficial for us, that keep us in a mode where, as we're going to look at, the effects of that fear can be very difficult for us, make us paralyzed, or make us, again, do things that are not necessarily going to be beneficial at the time. So it is important to delineate the two types. And mainly what we're looking at tonight then is what we might call unhealthy or unwholesome fear. Though even with some of the healthy or wholesome ones, if we look at them more deeply and maybe talk about that a little bit later, we can see how there's still some things about them that are not completely okay. Like I said, when you get to the final state of Buddhahood in our tradition, it's said to be a fearless state. So you don't have any of those fears, either wholesome or, unwholesome. So, in Buddhist terms, the element of this process of unwholesome fear arising can be seen in terms of the three primary distorted states of mind, also called the three poisons. Let me take it off screen for a moment to introduce these to you. Most of you have heard of these before. These three poisons are said to be at the root of all of our problems. And in fact, one of them, a deeper form of one of them, is said to be the root of all of them. But let's look at these three and kind of how they're operating in our lives. The very first one is what we call attachment or desire. Now, again, we're not saying that any form of an aspiration or desire is bad. It's good to have some healthy aspirations, to want to do good things with our lives, for example, or to want to become a Buddha, as we, set out in this tradition, to want to change our minds. These are very healthy desires and aspirations. We talk about the mind of desire or attachment. We're talking about a distorted mind that is looking at things that induce pleasure in us and wanting to kind of stay holding on to those, not be separated from them, kind of pulls them into our lives and then gets very upset, of course, when they disappear. And that leads us into that second emotion that is problematic, that second poison, which is the mind of kind of aversion, anger. It's what happens, as Venerable Rabina often points out, it's what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants. Our default mode is attachment. That's even behind that mind that I was mentioning that we get up with every day. We wake up and we go, oh, good, another day. I can't wait to have this and that and whatever. And then things start falling apart and we have, disappointments because that's the nature of things. We don't always get what we want or what we desire, but we're going about our lives with this default mode of desire, of craving, of wanting things to go our way. In fact, when the Buddha gave his very first teaching after he attained enlightenment, he pointed out what are called the Four Noble Truths. And the first truth is that we're in a state of dissatisfaction if we really look at it. Yeah. Even when we get what we want, it's not going to last. It's not going to be there forever because of the fact that things change. Things are uncertain, like I pointed out earlier. The second of the Noble Truths, the Buddha, in that very first sutra, that very first discourse, he said that the main source of all of that dissatisfaction is our desire, our craving. Again, there's a deeper root that I'll get into in a moment, but that is really the most direct route to our suffering, to our difficulty in our lives. We're constantly having this mode of craving and wanting and desiring. Now, at the very basic level, the Buddha said that there's nothing wrong with a fundamental wish to be happy and to avoid suffering. That's the starting point for everything the Buddha taught. So don't mistake my words or the Buddha's teachings in thinking that he's saying there's a problem with wanting to be happy or wanting to not suffer. That's not the problem. The problem is how do we go about accomplishing that? There's a lot of confusion out there, the Buddha says, in terms of how we go about trying to fulfill that fundamental wish, a desire to have happiness, wish to not suffer. At that level, there's nothing really wrong with that. That's perfectly fine starting point for everything the Buddha taught. The Buddha just says, guess what, folks? You're not going about it the right way because we tend to have that mind of attachment again that is looking for all those pleasurable, wonderful things and keep pulling them into ourselves to satisfy this sort of gaping hole that we have, to keep giving ourselves this pleasure. And we put all of our energy and effort into doing that, not recognizing that happiness actually comes from within. Happiness comes from a peaceful mind. And in fact, this mind of attachment and desire is not peaceful at all, something that's only going to give us problems. And then, of course, we see the problem with it, particularly when we don't get what we want, when we have that frustration because we think that we're going to accomplish something or get something in our lives, and we have to face the reality of not having that because that's the nature of our existence as well. We don't always get what we want, like the Rolling Stones saying, right? You can't always get what you want. I don't even know if sometimes you get what you need. I don't know. That's a whole nother investigation, perhaps, for someone else. But nonetheless, this is how we're going about our lives, is we're these two poles of like, I'm going after what I want because that'll bring me happiness. And I'm gonna then have to suffer whenever I don't get what I want. And we try to avoid over here and stay over here. And that's how we spend our whole lives, trying to get rid of anything that's going to cause us discomfort, problems, difficulty, and keep latching onto and pulling into our lives all the things that bring us pleasure. Now, the pleasure itself, or even the displeasure for that matter, or pain, those are not really kind of the main problem. Once more, it's our relationship to those things. Wanting pleasure in your life, again, it can get distorted pretty quickly. But nonetheless, that fundamental desire to be happy, to avoid suffering, there's nothing wrong with that. And the Buddha never said there was anything wrong with that. So these are distortions. When we go after things that we crave and desire, and then we get frustrated when we don't get those, and we have to face things that are the opposite of that. These are the two main poles we go between. Let me give you on the slides a little bit more, not quite technical description of these, but the way that I'm putting them out in terms of having something to talk about. Our default mode, again, is to come from the mind of attachment with a fundamental desire that wants things to be exactly how we like them to be. We all have things that bring us pleasure, and every one of us probably has very different things. There might be some commonalities, certain foods or certain things, music or whatever that we like. But really, people are quite unique in terms of what brings them pleasure. And they put all their money on those things and keep trying to keep those coming. All of those we really need for our happiness in this life. And then, of course, that's not always going to be the case. That's where aversion or anger arises. Then a threat, whether real or imagined, to that sense of security appears. And we react with aversion to the possibility that we might lose that and experience something painful or difficult. This is really, in my mind, where fear is coming in, is that fear is this anticipation of not having what we have come to rely upon as the sources of our pleasure and well-being, and which tend to be outside of ourselves. If they're inner qualities that we've generated, that's what this weekend is going to be about, is really, this upcoming weekend is going to be looking at these 8 pillars of joy that His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu identified as major sources of well-being and happiness. And they're all internal. It's not like cars and houses and all these various other things in our world that bring you joy and happiness and well-being. It's states of mind that can cultivate that. And we can have those in spite of what's going on in our world around us. But fear is driven by really these two poles then. Of course, it's got the undercurrent of ignorance that we're going to look at in a moment, the third of these three poisons. But we are in this default mode of continually looking for what we want that will bring us happiness, that will keep us on that plane of everything going our way, everything wonderful, having a great day. And then what happens when that gets interrupted? When suddenly we don't have that? Again, recall the pandemic. It's a very powerful example in our culture, in our world, in our time, of how all that was disrupted in a pretty major way for almost everybody. You know, there weren't a lot of people who were going about kind of happy lives. That maybe the people who were in long retreat and they didn't even hear about the pandemic and they were isolated from everybody else. They were having very happy minds in the midst of all that. But of course, if we learned to work with our minds, we could have had very different experiences of that. That's again the whole point. That's what Venerable Rabina was emphasizing in her talk, was that we can change our minds. We don't have to succumb to, especially these kinds of irrational, unwholesome fears that are going to make us crazy. You know? The world is pretty crazy when you look at what's going on and all the fear-based stuff. I was talking earlier with John and Isabella about how, in my estimation, and I know, I mean, it's hard to, even though things were only, what, 4 years ago that we were dealing with a national election, it seems like every time it just gets more and more fear-based, more and more putting another layer of stuff that we have to generate all this kind of stress and anxiety around in order to just determine who's going to lead this country. I mean, it's pretty outrageous. It's gotten to be an ordeal rather than something that we can gladly participate in. But once more, do we have to succumb to that? Do we have to get involved in all that? So, fear, although it's not identified as one of these separate mental factors, I see it very much falling on the aversion side of it to some degree. But the aversion side of it depends upon having the attachment to begin with. If we are attached to things continuing to be the way that we like them and so on, well, then naturally it's going to be fearful when we anticipate that they're going to go the opposite way. Now, again, I want to make sure that people don't misunderstand when I talk about things like the election. We do have to think in terms of the greater good too, and the less suffering for beings. You know, and those things do need to be considered. But those shouldn't be driven by attachment and desire. Those should be driven by more kind of sound and deeper rooted motivations, motivations of compassion and loving kindness and things that are wholesome states of mind, where we are looking at our world and trying to make the decisions that are best for all the beings in this world, not just human beings, but, you know, creatures in the sea and on the land and in the air and wherever, right? And those are very different criteria to use in terms of how we approach something like a national election. So don't mistake that what I'm saying is, oh, don't worry about anything, you know, and don't get caught up in any of it. It's make sure that we're removing the fear component of it because we see that it's being generated from these unwholesome states of mind. It's coming from our default of that craving and then getting frustrated when we don't get what we want or anticipate not getting what we want. So again, this is the thing to keep in mind in regard to this. Let's talk about this third one that again is said to be the root of the other two. It's generally labeled as ignorance, sometimes as confusion. I think another translation for it sometimes is bewilderment. And bewilderment isn't a word we use so much in our culture now, but we're really confused about things. This was the deepest truth that the Buddha taught. He said, you know, we are not seeing really the interdependence of things. If we want to kind of give it that label, there's many ways of talking about this ignorance, but we are blind to this reality of interdependence. We think of ourselves as kind of standalone little concrete entities, and we don't recognize our interdependence with all of the world, and that there is nothing standing on its own independently. Everything is intimately involved with everything else. And of course, this is ignorance. We can see it operative and going back to climate change. Look at how people, human beings, have made decisions about living their lives that have affected the world around them and other beings in this world around them by virtue of that interdependence. We can't do things completely in isolation. Things are done and have effects upon other beings and so on. So this deepest truth is a mistaken view, particularly of this sense of I that we think is somehow independently, concretely, solidly on its own. And we don't recognize the way that it actually exists. Again, that gets into much, much deeper teachings that I won't go into tonight because it's probably beyond the scope and even the time that we have. But this is often talked about as the antidote to that ignorance is the wisdom of emptiness, meaning that we're empty of, we lack that sense of being standalone, independent entities. We actually are quite interconnected with others and with the world. So when we sort of change our view there, well, then obviously there's no self that is all these other delusions are arising around, particularly the two that I pointed out a short while ago, anger and attachment. Anger and attachment are rotating around a solid sense of a self, of a person. And we are having reactions from that basis and that viewpoint. When we begin to identify the sense of kind of diminish the sense of self and identify this interconnectedness that we have with others, well, then we have a very different view of the world and we act very differently in the world because we see that how we treat others is really how we're treating ourselves, and how we treat our world is how we're treating ourselves, and so on. You become more conscious of what you're doing. So, obviously, with fear, this is also the undercurrent when we talk about these forms of unwholesome fear that are arising. They might be most directly connected to that sense of aversion on the basis of anticipating future pain, but then they also are rooted in that strong sense of me and what I have to go through and what I'm going to have to, suffer with on the basis of this anticipation of that future pain. So this is how it's operating. Let me go ahead and share the slide on this just so you have, again, some words behind what I just said that can read. Whoops, missed that one. Ignorance also plays a fundamental role, though, and this can be seen more specifically with regard to the one main fact of existence about which we have confusion. At the root of all our delusions is self-grasping, the ignorance that mistakenly holds the I to exist independently, inherently from its own side, which is in contrast to how it actually exists. Again, it's not just the I that is involved in this mistaken idea, but this is the main one. Because when we have that kind of central pole of this strong sense of an I that is at the root of all of our thoughts, well, then it's creating the other delusions. It's going to have us relating to things in an erroneous way. Whereas if we don't have that, and we kind of come to see the very subtle way that we exist and that everything exists in a very interdependent way, an interconnected way. And this is very profound teachings. I didn't want to go too deeply into it because, again, it takes some time to even get our heads around what this really means in terms of how we and all beings and all of our world exists. But this is the deepest truth that we have to realize at some point, and that will be the final way to undermine our fear. We'll look at that in a little bit and talk a bit more about emptiness. But again, I won't go too deeply into that. The Dhammapada, a wonderful collection of sayings from the Buddha. It's not used as much in the Tibetan tradition, though there is a Tibetan version of it that was translated from the Sanskrit. The Buddha initially taught in Sanskrit, and a lot of the teachings came into Tibet and were translated into Tibetan. He says, selfish attachment brings suffering. Selfish attachment brings fear. Be detached, and you will be free from suffering and fear. So what he's saying there, essentially, I mean, I don't really like the word detached so much, but nonetheless, this was a better translation of that verse that I found. Non-attached is a better way in my mind to talk about it. Detached makes it almost sound like we're, you know, totally not concerned with anybody else or the world around us. We're just going to get rid of our own attachment, be non-attached. Be in the world from a sense of that wisdom that understands how we actually exist, how our world exists, and attachment won't arise. We will have non-attachment. We will live our lives without that continual craving and grasping, and then, of course, the frustration that happens when we don't get that. So fear is not that foreign when it comes to the delusions, especially, again, these three root, and we can see how they all play a role. Venerable Rabina, I mentioned I was going to share how she talked about it, because, again, we're all anyone who's studied Buddhist psychology knows that fear isn't on the list of those different mental factors. And she said something really quite interesting. She said, fear is actually kind of the nature of all of the delusions. It kind of makes some sense, right? Because as soon as we feel like we set ourselves up as this standalone, independent entity, well, then we start fearing anything that will threaten that, anything that will get in the way of that, that doesn't support that, uphold that, try to please that. And this is how we live our lives, is we just continue our trying to get everything that strong sense of an I wants, to please it, to make it happy, and to avoid everything that even causes the smallest amount of suffering. I mean, look at how crazy we can go over something like a mosquito in our room that is there, keeping us awake at night and just driving us crazy, right? Because we have this strong sense of, I can't let myself be bothered by this. I can't let myself be bitten by this mosquito, and so on. We have just, again, this strong I that will arise and cause us all kinds of problems. So this is the way that I see fear, and I think Venerable Rabina's point is really, very good. That's kind of the underwriting nature of all of what the Buddha called delusions or afflictions. These are the unhealthy states of mind that the Buddha says that we can uproot. And we uproot them through a process of being able to investigate our minds and know what's going on. That's the very first step. That's why I always, whenever I lecture on any of these sorts of uh, delusions, afflictive emotions, I always talk about identifying them. What are they? Well, anytime that we're seeing these arising in our mind, then, we have to take some steps and actually begin to investigate. So that's where we're going to go from here, is to really take a look at, how do we work with these? I think that's coming up next, if I recall my slides. Oh, no, I wanted to share this. This is an important way to kind of talk about, although I've maybe already gotten it home to all of you in terms of how desire or attachment and aversion, the way that those two in particular work in our lives can be seen by what we often call the eight worldly concerns, meaning this is how we get caught up in our world, whatever that world, that microcosm or macrocosm that we're involved in. And they're set out in four pairs. So we have two that are kind of polar opposites, and we have a desire to avoid one and to get the other. And anyway, these are the things that we wish to attain, and they're opposites that we wish to avoid. I'll share these briefly. I've done like whole courses on this over like a weekend, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, they gave teachings on it frequently. This is really the thing that keeps us from being serious about spiritual practice, is that we get caught up in chasing after these things. So the first two all have to do with kind of things and the possessions that we have, things in our lives. I suppose that could even include people in our lives, but it's often referred to more in terms of material things. Craving for having those, and see how operative that is in our world, and but again, even in our own lives. Some of us may be pretty good at simplifying our lives in some vein, but maybe we still have problems with wanting to acquire things and have all those material possessions. And then, of course, we have the opposite, where we would lack or lose those material possessions, and we crave or desire not to have that occur. The next pair have to do with what we would call kind of our, these are the hardest ones. Venerable Rabina, when I talked to her once, she said, this is the one that is continually getting us, is our craving for happiness and comfort, and our craving to not have discomfort or unhappiness. I often point out, and I just flew into San Jose yesterday and went on Southwest. And of course, Southwest has that open seating thing, right? I'm sure many of you have flown Southwest before. And so you always want to make sure you're in like the A group or the first part of the B group. You start getting to the end of the B group or in the C group, and you're going to end up in like a middle seat, right? Well, it's such a simple thing, right? I ended up being on 3 1-hour flights because I had to fly through San Diego because the plane I was on to San Jose stopped there. But anyway, I didn't even get off the plane. But for three little 1-hour flights, you want to make sure that, you don't have the discomfort of sitting in a middle seat, right? I mean, just look at that. That's just a very simple way that we can see how much we crave comfort, how much we don't want to sit in that seat where you're between two bodies, and trying to figure out where to put your arms and all of that. Nobody reserves the middle seat if they're flying on their own, right? You don't go, oh yeah, I want that uncomfortable seat. I use it as an example because again, I think we do have this as really one of our major default things in terms of craving. We like everything to be comfortable. We want just the right temperature. We just want everything to be exactly the way that we like it. I use kind of this idea of our inner Goldilocks. Remember the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears? She wanted everything just right. And she thought she found it, but I don't know that that's necessarily so in our world, right? You might find things that satisfy and are good for you for the time being, but everything becomes uncomfortable after a while. And let's use the example of like your favorite piece of music, and maybe you've got a song now that you like that's out on the airwaves and you're really enjoying it and whatever. It's not airwaves anymore. What would it be? Net waves. I don't know. But the idea is that if imagine listening to that song for even 1 hour, like continuously, you'd probably be so sick of it, you never want to hear it again. Think about it for 24 hours. Things don't actually, make us happier and happier. They actually bring discomfort eventually. So even those things that we like are not that reliable. So once more, in this one, we're vacillating between always wanting things to be comfortable, enjoyable, bring us pleasure, and then not wanting it to be the opposite. Once more, don't confuse that with this fundamental desire for happiness and to avoid suffering, because there's nothing wrong with that. But is that the correct way to go about achieving happiness? To go after all of those temporary pleasures, all those things that are simply going to change on us? They're not going to ultimately satisfy. This is one of the major things the Buddha taught right from the beginning. We really have to look at all this stuff honestly. So this is a big pair for us. This is one that is really causing us a lot of problems. We go about our lives continually obsessed with everything being comfortable and never wanting a disruption to that. The last two pairs have more to do with kind of how other people see us. Reputation is in the wider circle when we talk about, how we're thought of in general in our larger groups in society, maybe locally or even in the workplace, in our family, what have you. And then praise and criticism, the last pair, are much more direct, right? That's when people actually say things to us that are, oh, good job, you're a wonderful person, great teacher, da 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 da. And then other times, oh, that was lousy, you did a horrible job, blah blah blah. We avoid criticism, we avoid a bad reputation, and this can be very, very painful, especially for a lot of people who really, stake a lot of what they do on the basis of having a good reputation and receiving praise. But these are distortions. Again, these eight worldly concerns are worth spending a bit more time outside of this to look at because that's a source of a lot of our fear. When we get a good reputation, then we're fearing that we're going to lose it all the time. We get material possessions and then we have to lock our house up and put in an expensive security system and do all these things to avoid somebody taking our beautiful, possessions. And all it goes, go right down the list. Every one of them is something that we get very attached to having it, and we don't want the opposite. We don't want to lose it, or we don't want to get, again, the criticism, the bad reputation, and so on. Again, I'm not saying that having these things is a problem. If you have a good reputation, be happy that other people like you, that you're thought of well, but don't be so attached to it. When people start talking and saying things that are opposite to that, well, again, don't get so bent out of shape when that happens. But we can see how fear is involved in that. It's a much more personal way than perhaps looking at, our um, national scene, what's going on with the elections and things like that. But in our own lives, these become very much a problem for us. Okay, let's get the effects of fear. I'm not going to spend that much time on this, but I think it is important to talk about it. Here, I'm going to quote Venerable Pema Chodron. Many of you know Pema Chodron, really wonderful author and teacher. She wrote a book called The Places That Scare You. I think some of this may be from that. I don't recall what source I got these from. But she says that she notices two ways that she reacts to fear. When fear starts to arise in her mind, first of all, it makes you speed up, makes you become hyperactive, where you act without full awareness of the consequences. And that's maybe an extreme, but we can see things that maybe are not quite as bad, but that we feel like we have to do something to confront what's going on. There's always that kind of motivation when, or not always, but a lot of the times that motivation that when something fearful is on our horizon, that we feel like we have to do something immediately to address it. We have to do whatever it takes. Again, we can make some unwise decisions on the basis of that. We don't really think of the consequences of our actions when we're driven in that way. The other thing is kind of interesting. It's the exact opposite. Again, I would say that probably these are the extremes, and we have many things that are between the two. Fear can also paralyze you and make you feel helpless, where you don't act at all, not doing what needs to be done. So when you become hyperactive and doing all kinds of stuff and not being really aware of what it is that you're doing or if it's even going to help. And then the other is you just sort of want to crawl in bed and eat cookies or something, and just say, I can't deal with any of it. Well, Buddhism is once more going to find a middle way response between these and a way where we can say, yes, it is important that we do something and that we actually certainly pay attention to what fear is going to be teaching us. It's another way that Pema Chodron often talks about things in our lives. She says these are always opportunities to learn. If we look at everything that's going on in our lives of, okay, what is this showing me? What can I learn from this? Well, fear has a lot to teach us. So if we have that kind of desire to investigate it, so we're not just immediately doing something, becoming hyperactive, and then we also have the vein of wanting to not just veg out and, put on the shutters and don't have anything to do with the world around us, then we actually have a much better state of mind. to deal with things, to actually contend with what's going on in our lives. So again, those are the two polar opposites. I mean, other things that I see certainly in my own life with fear is that fear can become contagious, infecting others with that same fear. This is one of the effects of fear in our world. I mean, look, it's what can't help but point out the election, how contagious fear is. You know, you hear it from somebody else. So did you hear what this person said? Did you hear what they said? Did you hear what the other side did? Da 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 da. You know, and then suddenly everybody's in that state of fear. I found an interesting poem the first time that I taught on fear by someone named Charles Simic. I never had heard of him, this poet. And it's kind of interesting, called Fear. He says, fear passes, I'll use from person to person. I think he meant it, you know, in a more general, human to human, unknowing, as one leaf passes its shudder to another. All at once, the whole tree is trembling, and there's no sign of the wind. This is kind of what happens with fear, right? There's no real wind going on, but there's just the passing the fear from one thing, one person to another, one leaf to another. And suddenly, you know, the whole world is trembling with fear. So this is one of the most kind of outrageous effects of fear, is that it just doesn't sit in our own little minds. It often is carried over into others. And it's something to be mindful of, even when we're talking about, we'll talk in a moment again about how to work with fear, but the idea of, do we really need to share our fear with others? Do we really need to bring it up to others? Do we need to, and again, I'm not saying that every moment of fear is unhelpful. There are certainly once more things that we should be aware of, that we should be making informed decisions in terms of our elections, in terms of what we do with our lives and so on, but keep it in that vein. Don't let it fall into where we're just instilling more and more stress and anxiety and fear in ourselves and in others. Another effect that I see certainly is that fear can block us from mindfully observing what is really going on and working with it. And maybe to some degree, this is even the way fear is used as a tool in our political system, is that it keeps people from looking at what really matters, because we get so caught up in fear-based stuff that we don't really look at the deeper things that would actually be more important to pay attention to and to put our energy into. And that leads us really into, how do we work with fear? How do we examine what's going on and make some different decisions about how we're going to react to what's going on in our world, in our minds, what have you. I'm using a little process that I found through, the third step is maybe a little bit of a jump, but there was a book called Fear by Thich Nhat Hanh. Many of you have heard of Thich Nhat Hanh. I never had the good fortune of meeting him or getting teachings from him. He passed away about 2 years ago, I think now, maybe a little bit longer, but amazing Vietnamese Zen teacher. He said the very first step is to invite fear in, you know, to not have this mind that really kind of panics at fear or feels like it's something we need to maintain some distance from, but really invite it in to see what we can learn from it. And I'll share some of his words in a moment on that. The second step is to really assess what we are fearing and why. I mean, really be our own. Lama Yeshe used to use the phrase, become your own therapist. Be your own therapist. Really say, you know, well, why are you having that thought? And why are you having that thought? If you don't stop at just like the first response, you have to keep digging deeper and deeper. That's what a good therapist does, right? It doesn't stop at, he or she doesn't stop at that kind of level of just what the first response is. You want to go deeper and deeper and really get at, well, what's underneath that and what's underneath that? Then, thirdly, apply our understanding of Buddhist principles to transform our fear into the path. This, of course, is for people who are subscribing to a Buddhist path. You could probably use teachings from other spiritual traditions as well. But I'll be pointing out some of the things that Buddhism offers that are really useful. Even sharing some teachings from His Holiness the Dalai Lama in terms of when he was asked about how to work with fear. So this is what Thich Nhat Hanh says in regard to this first step. He says the first part of looking at our fear is just inviting it into our awareness without judgment. It's already quite a difficult step in some regard, because we might be pretty self-critical when we have fear arising or have other judgments around it. He says we just acknowledge gently that it is there. This brings a lot of relief already. You know, there was a book, I think I've got a quote later from it, maybe, I'm not sure. There was a book of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings on fear called Smile at Fear. Maybe that takes a while to get to that place where we smile at fear, like, oh, good, here you are. But this is something in Tibetan Buddhism we call mind training, where we almost look forward to having problems, difficulties, fear, anything that is negative, because it's a wonderful opening and opportunity for us, right? I mean, that's a hard place to get to, where you like, there was the story about this wonderful Indian master, Lama Atisha. Lama Atisha went to Tibet, crossed over from India into Tibet, made that arduous journey. Of course, he was known for making major journeys. He even went all the way down to Indonesia to obtain teachings and made it all the way back. But anyway, it's said that when he went to Tibet, he wasn't sure that there were going to be annoying people there. So he took with him this Bengali tea boy who was really annoying for him. And so he would essentially, anytime that this guy said something to him that bothered him, it was an opportunity for him to practice patience, for him to kind of be with that and go, okay, here he goes again. But, try to keep a positive mind, try to keep these thoughts. I mean, how many of us want to have an annoying person in our life to do that for us? I mean, that's a pretty big thing. But the idea that I'm getting across here is that we should welcome things in like this and say, okay, here's this difficult emotion called fear. But have a seat, come in, let's talk, let's figure out what's going on with you. But we tend to once more do those things like Pema Chodron said, we just get hyperactive and we avoid really looking at it. We feel like we need to do something to address it. I'm having this fear and I need to do something. Or again, we don't want to look at it, so we just pull the blinds closed and crawl into bed and that's it. We give up. Well, those are again extreme responses to it. In this case, we're just going to invite it in and say, okay, what do you have to teach me? How can I learn from this? Again, like Pema Chodron says, this is life giving us the lessons we need to learn. Things are coming into our lives, and we can learn from everything. We can learn from the most obnoxious person, like the Bengali tea boy. We can learn from the people who are loving and kind. Fear has a lot to teach us. Again, we do this investigation, seeing, well, where is it coming from and so on. We're going to go to that step. But that will definitely be worthwhile. Whereas if we just shut it out or follow it sort of blindly with this hyperactivity, that's not so beneficial. So assess what we are fearing and why. Then Thich Nhat Hanh says, then once our fear has calmed down, we've given it a seat, give it a cup of tea, let it just relax and make itself at home. Then we can embrace it tenderly and look deeply into its roots, its sources. Understanding the origins of our anxieties and fears will help us let go of them. I mean, this can be really quite liberating when we kind of become our own therapist and identify what exactly is happening in our minds at the moment that is causing that fear to arise. And how rational or irrational is it? What is it telling us? Chogyam Trungpa used to talk about, again, I don't have that much knowledge of his teachings. In fact, I find sometimes his books very difficult to read. I don't know why, but that's just me. Not really have a good karmic connection with him, I suppose. But Pema Chodron was a student of his, and she says that he used to talk about how we all have this soft spot. I always point here because that's where I sort of feel it myself. But that's kind of our place of vulnerability. And fear is really pointing out that vulnerability, right? We all have that. And it's giving us the opportunity to be very courageous in the face of that, to actually develop incredible qualities by confronting and working with our fears, inviting them in and saying, okay, what's going on with you? Why are you coming into my life? What's happening? What is it that I need to pay attention to? What do I need to do to change my mind? It's an incredible gift if we can actually invite it in, because it will get us more in touch with this soft spot, with this place of vulnerability that is the source of our greatest courage. Something we're going to look at when we get to the final topic about fearlessness. But we need to have fear to become fearless in a sense, right? Just like you need to have that negative thing in order to generate the opposite to it, to really work with it. In Buddhism, we often use the analogy of a lotus. I heard Kamala Harris's first name is Lotus. Kamala means lotus. But anyway, a lotus, if you've ever seen them grow, they grow in the muckiest parts of the ponds and the lakes and whatever. It's all like really dirty and disgusting. And they come up, the stem comes up, and then they flower unsullied by the mud. I think Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book called No Mud, No Lotus. You need that negative stuff as the source from which something beautiful can come. That's the only way that you become fearless is by working with fear. The only way that you overcome your greed and become, more generous is by having that greed and seeing it and going, oh, wow, I see how stingy I am, how miserly I get when people ask me for money or whatever, right? You don't become aware of it otherwise. So we always need these things in our lives, and we need to learn from them and to see what they're all about. What's the lesson they're giving us? So that's the second step, is to really do that investigation. Say, okay, you're here in my life. I've invited you in. What is it that you can teach me right now? Very different approach, again, to working with fear. Um, I think one that can be really fruitful, really productive for us. I also want to examine a little bit of what His Holiness says, which relates to a verse from Shantideva that I'll share in a moment, a great Indian 8th century Buddhist master. In His Holiness's book, which I'm going to use some quotes from later when we talk about his methodology for working with fear, book called A Policy of Kindness, he says, if you have fear of some pain or suffering, you should examine whether there is anything you can do about it. If you can, there's no need to worry about it. But if you cannot do anything, then there's also no need to worry. Why? Because your worry is pretty futile if you can't do anything about something. This goes back to this verse that I mentioned. This is from the 6th chapter of Shantideva's text. It's actually the chapter on patience, how we develop patience in the face of those things that bring about some potentially anger, aversion, energy, which once more is where fear fits in quite nicely. He says in that text, this is one translation of it, why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being unhappy about something if it cannot be remedied? I mean, this is maybe an initial stage of investigation when we've invited fear in, is to really look at that and say, okay, what am I fearful of? Is this something I can do something about? I'll go back to my doctor analogy that, or my doctor story that I used earlier. When I got that news from my father's doctor that I needed to change things or I was going to potentially die at an early age from all the complications that were already showing in my blood work and everything, well, then I decided to change things, right? Would have been silly if I just listened to that and go, okay, yeah, you know, I'll just live with that fear. I'll just continue to have that mind that's worried about dying early and what have you. No, change things, do something different. A lot of things that we have in our life, we actually can do something about. Now, when it becomes larger issues, it becomes a little more difficult. Maybe, the things that we can do are somewhat limited, but we still can do something about almost everything we encounter. Certainly, there are some of those undeniable facts. We all are going to have to die. That's why it's very powerful in Buddhism to work with contemplating our own death and trying to be mindful of our own death, because it's something that is undeniable that we have to learn to accept. And then, of course, work with that to change our minds and what we do with our lives in order to make death, when it does come, not such a shock. But nonetheless, if there's something we can do to change things, which is often the case, we'll put our energy there. It doesn't make sense to put all of our energy into being fearful. So this is really good advice in this kind of topic of when we look at fear and where it's coming from, let's also look at whether it's something we can do anything about, right? Makes some sense. Then the next step to go into, how do we actually work with it in regard to some of the Buddha's teachings? Thich Nhat Hanh, in introducing this, it's not quite, again, the same thing I'm saying, but it's in the same vein. He says, if you can look deeply into your fear and have a clear vision of it, then you really can live a life that is worthwhile. I kind of extrapolated from living a life that's worthwhile to identifying, again, through His Holiness's teachings, some of the main Buddhist teachings that we can bring to mind and work with. This is often the case in any of these mind training teachings that I mentioned a short while ago, right? Where we change our minds in terms of how we are going to work with a problem, a difficulty, some situation into something that's actually really beneficial. We call that kind of transforming our suffering into the path, transforming difficulties into really wonderful things for helping us to grow spiritually. So let's take a look at some of this. Since Dharma is that which holds or protects from suffering, we need to take heartfelt refuge in the Buddha's teachings whenever we feel fear. So this is maybe kind of the initial step, is where does our mind go? When fear arises, and we got another what month until the election, right? Practically, isn't it about a month, a little less than a month? So, we're a lot more things are going to come down the pike, right? We're going to have new things every day in the news and new things we're hearing, unless you shut it all off at this point. Maybe I don't know, you're doing early voting in California already. So maybe you've already voted and you can just like, okay, it's already decided, it's already done. That's great. I think New Mexico started yesterday. I was flying, so I'm going to have to vote when I get back. But nonetheless, wherever you're at with all that, know that again, where does your mind go when that fear starts to arise? What is it that you see as the medicine that can be applied at that point? Is it the Buddhist teachings or any other spiritual teachings? Or is it continuing to buy in to all that fear culture that we have? We have a choice right there. What are you going to rely upon? Where are you going to put your money and say, okay, this is a much healthier, better thing for me to do is to think about the Buddhist teachings or think about, again, any other spiritual tradition. And what is it telling me in terms of how to deal with this? That's already a huge step, right? Well, let's look at a few of the topics that His Holiness identified in a policy of kindness. These are the ones that he looked at, the first three in particular, and I added on tantric methods because I'm not going to go into huge teachings about that, but nonetheless, there are some things that we can do there, even if we're inclined towards that. The first one, His Holiness identified karma, but I'm in throwing in there renunciation, and I'll explain that word in a moment when we go to the next slide. But the second one is those wonderful qualities, some of which, again, we're going to look at a little bit this weekend with the Book of Joy, the 8 pillars of joy: compassion, loving kindness. That should be another S on kindness, sorry, and bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a very special mind that's induced by loving kindness and compassion. Then the third, the wisdom of emptiness that I mentioned earlier, that can even be something that we apply at that time. If we have some understanding of it, that can be really useful. And then again, these tantric methods, Buddhist Tantra. So His Holiness starts by saying, one way to work with deep fears is to think that the fear comes as a result of your own actions in the past. And even the situation comes as a result of your own actions in the past. Now, I know karma is a really kind of involved topic. I'm currently teaching the Discovering Buddhism module on karma for the center in San Francisco on Monday nights. And it's a very difficult topic, and I don't want to go into huge discussions of karma. But karma is the principle that is essentially saying that what we experience is always a product of our past actions, which is, of course, our minds. Our minds are creating what we think, and then therefore what we say, what we do, and all of that ripens into our experiences. So once more, using Pema Chodron's idea that when something is manifesting in our lives, our fear or something that we are fearful of, if we hold that view and say, okay, this is a product of my own actions in the past. And of course, the immediate thought that we might have on the basis of that, oh, what a lousy person I was if this is such horrible stuff I'm experiencing, all that guilt that we lay on ourselves. It's interesting, in Tibet, they don't have a word for guilt. This is a Western creation. Probably should do a course on guilt. But anyway, the idea is that if we don't, if we look at this from a sense of responsibility and saying, okay, I did these things in the past, well, then once more, as Pema Chodron says, then this is a lesson for me. I created this. So how do I kind of uncreate it? How do I make sure I don't create the same thing again? How do I actually look at this as once more a very valuable opportunity to do something different? And I threw in renunciation there because renunciation is a thought that often follows after karma, because we begin to see that what we are involved in, we can modify our behavior and have different results. Certainly, that's one of the messages, again, that the Buddha taught from the beginning as well. If you change what you do, you change what you experience. Of course, you change your mind, you also change the way that you experience those things. But we begin to see that this cycle that we're caught up in, being under the control of this karma, and of course the delusions that I mentioned earlier, start developing some sense of this being really unsatisfactory. That's what the mind of renunciation is. And the Buddha taught there's a solution to that. Going back to the Four Noble Truths, I mentioned the first two earlier, the Buddha said there can be an end to this state of dissatisfaction. That's the third Noble Truth, which of course then you ask the question, well, how? That's the truth of the path that leads to that. And the very first component of the path to a large degree is renunciation, is saying, okay, been there, done that. I've had enough of this existence that is unsatisfactory, and I want to attain something that's reliable, that I can actually experience for eternity, a state of peace and, satisfaction, nirvana. All of this is attainable through the Buddhist path. So when we have things happening in our lives that are problems and difficulties, one of the main tools we use initially is to say, that's just another sign of how unsatisfactory all of this is. And I need to turn away from looking at that as the source of my happiness, once more seeing that happiness resides within me. The state of nirvana isn't a change of our external world. The state of nirvana is a change of our internal world. It means that we then experience things from a lens of freedom, a lens of peace. And that's attainable by every one of us. So anyway, that's the idea behind this first level of teachings. And if you've had teachings in this tradition, no doubt you've encountered those two things, karma and renunciation. But we begin to kind of generate those thoughts when we see fear arising. Of course, fear can also be a doorway for us to generate these very positive states of mind. It says also someone who is engaging in the bodhisattva practices, bodhisattva being those who are intent upon attaining Buddhahood, seeks to take other sufferings onto themselves. When you have fear, you can think, others have fear similar to this. May I take to myself all of their fears? So this is a way when we see fear rising in our own minds, we go, oh, this is a doorway to identifying how others have similar fears. And rather than wanting to feed their fears by talking to them about our fears and everyone becoming again like all the leaves of the tree that are all shaking and trembling, even though there's no wind, be mindful of how, others are sharing that same sort of fearful experience. Start to have compassion for others like you are having fear. And that means others on any side of the fence that we're dealing with politically, to really be able to look at it as everyone is suffering. Everyone is suffering with this mind of fear. Now, the practice that's being alluded to here to some degree is this practice we call Tong Len in Tibetan, taking and giving, meaning that we want to generate in the face of seeing our own suffering or the suffering of others, a wish that that be relieved and that we become the agent of doing that. It's a very powerful mind to actually think, oh, may I take on their fear and their frustration and their suffering and their anxiety and their difficulty. And may I give them peace, happiness, well-being, all the things that I would want for myself. This is again a very advanced practice, but nonetheless, even just to some degree, if we can start opening to the reality of how we're not alone in our suffering, that's a huge, huge movement of our minds. We generate more compassionate thoughts towards others. We generate more loving kindness towards them. And eventually we can generate this mind, bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is that wish to become a Buddha for the sake of others, to really develop ourselves to that degree so that we can be fully dedicated to their welfare without any obstacles. We can, act perfectly for their welfare. So again, this is the idea behind that comment that His Holiness is making there, is that if we can become more cognizant of others, their situations, and not be so tightly bound up in our own narrow view, then that can be quite liberating. His Holiness continues, he says, even though you are opening yourself to greater suffering mentally by kind of taking on the suffering of others in your mind, taking greater suffering to yourself, as he says, your fear lessens. It is kind of interesting how when we get into a more compassionate place, our fear actually diminishes to some degree. That's because that's a much more courageous place to be, right? If we think about being that uh, not quite savior of the world. They use that term sometimes in Buddhism, though it's not maybe quite accurate, but we want to be that source of reliable direction for everyone, to provide them with what they need to find ultimate peace and happiness. And it's pretty outrageous state of mind to be in. But even if we just, as I said, just a little bit more compassion, just a little bit more compassion when we see fear arising in ourselves, to think about others who are experiencing that fear. Uh, Wisdom of emptiness. Here we are. I've got 10 minutes left and introduce this very profound topic, but it says another technique His Holiness says is to investigate who is becoming afraid. Examine the nature of yourself. Where is this I? Who is I? What is the nature of I? Is there an I besides my physical body and my consciousness? And he says, this may help. This is, as I said, the final antidote. And this is really the most profound of the Buddha's teachings and very difficult to realize. But if we at least have some loosening of that strong sense of an I that's at the core of all this, as I explained earlier, that everything's rotating around this me, and what I need. In fact, there's a video, I think it was Mipam Rinpoche who did a song, kind of a very clever song called What About Me? You can still find it on YouTube. It's quite a nice little catchy melody. But he says, this is how we live our lives. What about me? What about me? Of course, that keeps us, blocked to having compassion for others to a large degree because it's solely around us. But there's an error that we're making, as I mentioned earlier, in thinking that there is this concrete, self-existent, independent I. And that investigation is a big part of Buddhist practice and all Buddhist traditions, kind of removing some misconceptions that we have about who we really are, that are what's causing us to get confused about our world around us. The last thing that I want to share in terms of a way to work with it is, from Tantra. Tibetan Buddhism offers many methods. This is from an article by a woman named Marcela Clavijo, I think. Anyway, it says there are many methods for recognizing, overcoming, and ending disturbing emotions, including fear. Some are grounded in awareness of the body. Green Tara, who represents the aspect of a Buddha that protects us from fear, also represents the energy winds of the body and breath. And she's very much about working with the body and all of that. And in Tantra, you do practices that are with wind energy and the body and so on. But we have this Buddha, which is actually the topic of my talk here next Thursday, a week from tomorrow, that I'll be going into a bit more detail on. She's the embodiment of that kind of force that comes into play in confronting fears, dangers, and so on. Tara's influence is the capacity to act, to move through life and accomplish our aims. Indeed, her name means she who ferries across, she who takes us from our crazy, awful, unsatisfactory state into the state of peace and happiness and well-being. So this can be used to some degree, and if you have some confidence in some of the tantric techniques, you can recite her mantra, Om Tare Tutare Ture Soha. I'll talk a bit about that mantra and a bit more about her next Thursday in I think we're calling that activating feminine energy in Buddhist practice. But that's a picture of Green Tara, this wonderful female Buddha. I know that there's something I'll touch on as well, a lack of female Buddhas in Buddhism iconography. But she really represents that embodied wisdom together with a very powerful, blissful state of mind that can cut through nonsense, cut through everything. And we need that kind of energy. So, what does fearlessness look like when we worked with fear through these techniques, through inviting it in, seeing what fear has to teach us, investigating it, and then, of course, applying what we can of the Buddha's teachings? Got a few slides on that from first Chogyam Trungpa, again, the book that I mentioned earlier, Smile at Fear. He says, fearlessness comes from fear. The logic is quite simple. You might ask, for example, why someone takes a shower. You shower because you feel dirty. The dirt is what really makes you want to clean up. Similarly, fearlessness comes from fear. I talked about this earlier, but I just wanted to emphasize this is don't think that fearlessness means shutting out your fear or avoiding your fear. You have to invite your fear in, and then you can generate fearlessness because you can actually learn from fear and develop different states of mind, different teachings that you apply at that time that are an alternative to fear. And then Pema Chodron says to be fearless isn't really to overcome fear, it's to come to know its nature. So that's another perspective on it. When we really know what fear is and we're able to be with fear, identify it, know what it's teaching us, well, then we become fearless in a sense because we no longer succumb to the emotion of fear, but rather once more use it in a much more productive way. And then the last quote is from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he uses from the other side, courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. So I like that quote too, because I think it's spelling out, again, courage as being the major antidote to fear. When we are able to not react habitually, impulsively, but rather respond effectively to what's going on in our world and what's going on in our lives, those things that are impulses for fear, well, then that's courage. That's what it means to be fearless. That's what it means to actually look at these things and to become a voice of reason and wisdom and compassion in the midst of whatever is going on. So sorry I didn't leave too much time for questions or comments, but can open it up for that now. I don't know if there are any from folks online. Um, yes, please. Of the slides? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. You know, what I'm the question had to do with yeah, whether the slides, if they could take pictures of them. I actually can print up a file of the slides, you know, in like a PDF and then get them to Isabella, and then Isabella will, where will you put them? Okay. Great. Isabella, if you didn't hear that, then she's going to send a bulk email out to everyone who attended tonight, who registered, and you know was she's got everyone's email addresses, so she'll do that. So I'll get that to her later tonight or tomorrow morning, and she'll have that out when she gets a moment. So anyway, yeah, yeah, I'm happy to share things in that regard. I would have shared them earlier so people could have them, you know, before the class, but I was still kind of monkeying with them earlier today. So. Any questions online from anybody? Anyone there? Or again, even here in the Gompa as well? Or comments? You can share something, a reflection that you have in terms of, because I don't have a monopoly on knowledge about fear, trust me. I'm not
I
the
I
only source of wisdom in the room. Yes, please.
I have a question.
Great.
The point of being fearless for others. I understand that situation. So that is looked upon. So even though you might not be necessarily facing the fear, you might be just being courageous to get through the fear for the other person. Is that still a permanent, or still a effective change?
Mm. Could you explain it a little bit more, Damien? Just because I'm not following exactly this what you're saying. Just
Yeah,
give me
that wasn't very clear. Um,
just
so
okay, do an example that might be good,
so
if you
for
have one.
so, so for example, you're with a friend, and the friend might be afraid of something, a tree branch falling. Now, you catch their fear, and in order to help them not be fearful, you put on a bit more of a courageous front.
Hmm.
Yet I might be fearful of that branch falling as well
Hmm.
for myself, but because I'm trying to be courageous for my friend,
Right.
I'm I'm avoiding my own fear in that case.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a little tricky because again, the idea is that we should be looking at our own fear initially and developing some alternative ways of looking at it, working with it, and then we can perhaps be a better source of support. Now, but it still sounds like what you're proposing, though, in this example, is still a compassionate response because we don't want people, especially if they're dealing with irrational fears. Again, I don't know this example of a tree branch falling or something, how rational or irrational it is. If you're in Florida right now and you're dealing with the hurricane coming through, it's quite rational to have that fear and to want to do what you can to avoid being in the path of a falling tree branch, right? So,
Correct.
you know, it would depend, but if you're dealing with somebody who's having an irrational fear and you were trying to do what you could to alleviate it by that type of courageous stance, I think that can be seen as a very compassionate way to work with it. Doesn't mean that we've overcome our own fears unnecessarily. Um, but I think it's really quite useful. I mean, parents do this with children often, right? If you have children who have nightmares or have fearful things that are come into their mind on the basis of seeing a TV show or something, and they suddenly are imagining all kinds of things that could be going on. And in that case, even though the parent maybe hasn't completely dealt with their own fear, they know that what the child is going through is irrational, and they don't need to have those fears keeping them up at night and causing them to be disturbed and what have you. So I think it's nice to have that desire and even, you know, to do what you can to alleviate the fears of others, whether or not we've dealt with our own fears. But if it is something that we haven't looked at for ourselves, then there's another step involved in there. And we often talk about how all of our Buddhist practice begins with looking at ourselves and having compassion for ourselves and working with our own minds. Then we're more skillful at working with others. That's why even tonight, when I was pointing out the different teachings, it starts with considering our own situation. You know, in terms of our karma and developing a sense of renunciation for ourselves, then we can have a mind of compassion and loving kindness towards others. But there's no reason why we can't kind of mix it up occasionally and understand that, yeah, there's going to be times where we need to be the courageous voice in the room, even though we still might have fears underneath that. So I don't know. It's not a clear answer one way or the other, but I think it is beneficial often for us to go ahead and take that stance when others maybe are not doing that. Stand up to that fear ourselves, even though perhaps we still have our own fear in the corner somewhere. Did that help, Damien, somewhat?
It did, sure did. Thank you. Makes sense.
Good, good. Yes, please. There's a microphone coming your way, if you don't mind, so folks at home can hear. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I just had a question. Maybe you went over it earlier, but that first step about inviting fear in without
Mhm.
judgment. I'm forgetting if you went over advice on how to do this, but do you have any personal advice on how to approach it without judgment?
Yeah. I think again, to the extent that we've dealt with our own issues around judging ourselves, having, guilt or feeling horrible about what we have in our lives that's inducing fear, then I think we'll be able to do that more. But those are also steps that we need to be attentive to. Judging mind. My God, that's a whole nother course in and of itself, right? We look at how we judge others and how we judge ourselves. And those are voices often that they become habituated in our minds that we need to really look at once more in a similar way, invite our judgment in and say, okay, what do you have to teach me in terms of that is often a distortion. When we judge ourselves bad for having fears or for, not being up for everything that's happening in our lives, well, that can be, again, a pretty distorted state of mind and not really looking at things accurately. And we have to be able to kind of look judgment in the face and say, is that really accurate? So I don't know. I mean, inviting fear in without judgment is probably a process that we have to work on. Do you find in particular when you have fear arising that there are some judgments that are coming up for you around that?
I think that
Maybe
feels.
microphone.
I think finding the fears that come up, I tend to see them as like irrational. And then I'm like, oh, why are you having this fear? It's irrational.
All
Like
right.
questioning
Uh-huh.
the rationality of it.
Yeah. And then there may be some putting yourself down because you're having those irrational thoughts. But I think, again, as long as we're learning from it, even if we see that we're being irrational, well, then that's often an invitation for us to look more rationally at things and to really change our minds so that we're not following irrational thoughts and behaviors that follow from that. So I think we have to be kind of kind to ourselves and often once more look at everything as a learning opportunity, even when we have things that are coming up that are judgments or that where we think we are perhaps being irrational in what we're thinking about. Well, then we can learn from that too. We can say, okay, how do I look more honestly at what's going on? How do I actually see things in a more accurate way? Um, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, and I'm not denying that Western psychology, I'm sure, has many valuable tools to work with a lot of these things around fear as well. I'm presenting it to some degree from a Buddhist perspective with a little bit of Western psychology, but I think Western psychology can help frequently to look at patterns of thought and how we're looking at things, judgments and what have you, and dismantle them. And so that we don't have to continually follow them either. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. I don't have much beyond that. I wish I'd studied Western psychology more too myself. Buddhist psychology doesn't often talk about a lot of these things. We don't even the word judgment we don't use so much. It's kind of interesting, but in the West, it's everywhere, right? Especially self-judgment. Yeah, we have another question over here. Yeah, maybe another one or two, and then we'll
Yeah, I
conclude.
just wanted to springboard off of what she was just saying.
Uh-huh.
I was flashing while you were talking on business school training. They teach you if you really want to get somebody to do something, if
Hmm.
you want to create an action, you've got four motivators: need, greed, fear, and exclusivity.
Oh, wow.
So you can pretty much be certain that there's massive fear being projected on us that leads to these irrational fears, because we're just hammered on every billboard and commercial and web pop up, and they're using those fears to manipulate us, but then they become real inside of our minds over time. Like if you say project something enough times, you start to believe it. So that could be just a little piece to your puzzle there, is we're living a capitalist society, and fear is how they get us to do things.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. It was a very good talk.
Oh, well, you're welcome. But thank you for sharing that. That was really useful in terms of, because I think we don't realize how pervasive it is in our culture, and it's good to open our eyes to that and realize that those influences do have an effect on almost all of us to some degree. Before I get to the question there, maybe we had Damien's hand come up online, but hold on to the microphone. We'll get a chance to, yeah, Damien, if you wouldn't mind coming in and asking or commenting. Are you still there? Well, then let's go to the Gampa. Sorry. Okay.
I just had a comment.
Uh-huh.
I've done a bit of the Tonglen practice, and I just thought it's the most effective, thing that I've ever experienced when it comes to overcoming fears. Because, like, we've heard the phrase that the giver receives the gift, and I think that's so true. I mean, I just think it's really worked for me in
Wonderful.
the past.
No, thanks for sharing that, because I think Tonglen can be incredibly powerful, especially dealing with fears, because it gets us into that place of not being as focused on our own stuff. We're focused on others and their needs and their concerns. I mean, there's always those wonderful stories about how people in the midst of something that's really tragic happening lose all that sense of reserve that they would normally have. Like there's videos of horrible accidents where somebody's burning in the car, and people who are just walking on the street go rushing in there to save this person and drag them out of the car before they burn. And most people wouldn't think about doing that in a rational way, but they put themselves aside and immediately want to go and help. It's wonderful to see that sort of response. And that's the sort of mind we're developing in Tonglen, is that wish to not have that other person suffer. Of course, Tonglen, often they say it should start with ourselves too. We should really be looking at our own situation and developing that same amount of compassion, love, and so on. And then we can apply it to others. But very powerful practice. Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. So she was saying that that's how she uses it, is to start with herself and her own suffering, and then can extrapolate and talk about other suffering and the wish for them not to suffer in the way that you yourself are suffering. I think that's very powerful. So I'll check in one more time with Damien. Did you have a question that you wanted to share? Your hand is up in the Zoom room. Maybe not. Okay.
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Last question was, you mentioned that Tibet doesn't have the word, or Buddhists don't have the word for guilt.
Right.
How do they see that then?
My understanding in that them not having a word for guilt is that they don't really have that thought, that emotion. It's kind of maybe again, when you grow up in a culture where you have teachings on karma from a very young age, where you don't see it through the lens of this is something I should feel horrible about and treat myself poorly because I'm this way or that way. Instead, they're acknowledging that that is simply a product of their minds in the past that made certain decisions that they can change and they can do something different. It's seen in a much more positive light. In the West, we tend to layer this guilt. And there's nothing wrong. Don't get me wrong. There's I'm going to say wrong twice here. There's nothing wrong with thinking that the things you did are wrong. That's an okay thought to say, okay, I I have some serious regret that I said this or did this to that person. But guilt is kind of adding on to that and saying, and I'm a horrible person and I really suck, or whatever language we use, that self-judgment, that guilt trip that we put on ourselves is not beneficial, because what does it do? It has no productive quality to it, because once more, the Buddha says we all can change. We all have the ability to change our minds to an extraordinary degree. again, to become a Buddha, to become this embodiment of all these positive qualities and to be that forever, essentially. So that is not who you are, is the person that this self-judging mind, with the guilt lays on and says, oh, I'm a horrible person, I'm an awful person, blah, 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 blah. So that's the idea behind it, is they don't really have that thought. Yeah, Patrick was going to add something, perhaps.
I've heard it called intelligent regret.
Intelligent regret. That's
because you've made a mistake about, oh, I know better than to say harsh words. That's why that happened to me.
And it's just, I think guilt has become part of our culture where we don't have that intelligent regret. We always feel lousy about ourselves because we did something that makes us feel bad. Well, making you feel bad, that's a good response. It is good to feel bad if you just yelled at somebody for no reason or really upset them with something you said. Yeah, you shouldn't be doing that because that's not a good way to create harmonious relationships and be in the world. But to think you're a horrible person because you did that, that's just extra baggage. Western psychologists, I'm sure, deal with a lot of that. And they're, whoever comes in has got some measure of guilt. We've got another question or comment. Oh, like cancel culture. Yeah. 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 Oh, cancel culture. Yeah. Right, exactly. Because we think once they've done something that indicates that all it is them saying that they did something, or people maybe even just accusing them of doing something that is not so good, right? And that's just one value statement that we're making. But then we cancel them and we want nothing to do with them and we get them out of our, that's the whole person. I mean, that's one thing I'll point out on this, and then we should conclude for tonight, is that if you think about the time when you were really lousy to somebody, because we've all done it at least once in this life, right? We, maybe had too many to drink or whatever was going on, and we said or did something that was really hurtful to another person. Is that the sum total of who you are? It was just maybe a few moments in your life. And would you want to be judged on the basis of that? That everyone in the world think that that is who you are? I mean, the case is there for, I'm not saying that everyone who's been involved in cancel culture and been the product of that or the recipient of that they've all been angels throughout their whole life except for that one moment. But nonetheless, we do that. We tend to focus on that negative and we make that the sum total of it. And we do that with ourselves and we do that with others. And of course, that's not the Buddhist view at all. The Buddhist view is that we are a combination of many things, many of them good, some things that are not so good, and we have the potential to be completely good, kind of advance those qualities. So again, I'll talk more about some of these things in the weekend course on the 8 Pillars of Joy. And then, yeah, next Thursday, if you're interested in green Tara and kind of what Buddhism calls feminine energy, which is not so gender-based as much as it is looking at different aspects of all of us that we all have that we need to emphasize more equally and make sure that we have kind of a more balanced approach to our path. I'll be talking about that then. So let's just have some closing thoughts. These are just a way of concluding our time together and kind of, yeah, sealing what we've done in a sense with a very positive energy. So think about what we had at the beginning, these thoughts about wanting our own fear to be something we can work with skillfully, and also that the fears of others can be managed in a more skillful way by them as well, and that we want to become a source of that for others. Again, in Buddhism, that the ultimate goal is to become a Buddha where we can do that perfectly. We can help all beings to be free from all of their fears, to be free from all suffering and dissatisfaction, and to attain complete peace and well-being. So we dedicate for that result. What we've done here tonight will become the cause for our own development of our mind to that degree and our ability to help others to do the same. Okay, thank you all for being here tonight and everyone online. Appreciate you joining, and I will look forward to seeing some of you again. So, and thanks to Isabella, Patrick, everyone supporting here at Land of Medicine Buddha. It's such a joy to be back with all of you. Okay, blessings everyone. Be well.
Thank you.